The western doors had not opened since the third bell, yet everyone in the lower restoration hall had already begun speaking more softly. No one had asked them to. The attendants of return had made no gesture, and the chamber lights had not changed from their patient amber. But the quiet moved through the hall the way evening moved through the garden decks after the heat had gone out of the stones. It gathered first around the benches nearest the archway, where the old navigators sat with their hands folded over their knees, and then reached the young record keepers along the inner wall, and then the children, who had been permitted to remain, because he always said a return should never be hidden from those who would one day serve the mandate. The vessel held the silence carefully. Beneath the polished floor, the old spiral conduits hummed in their familiar intervals, not loud enough to be noticed by those born aboard, but present enough that any change in their rhythm made people lift their heads. Warm mineral air moved through the western passage, carrying the faint scent of restoration oils, copper leaf tea, and the darker sweetness of the memory roots that grew in the upper gardens. Someone had placed a bowl of salt fruit beside the nearest pillar, though no one had touched it. It had been his habit to take one piece whenever he passed this hall, even when late, even when summoned, even when pretending not to see that the kitchen children had counted how many he took. Myra had polished the bowl twice since morning. She was 12 cycles old and had been given no task beyond waiting, which she considered unfair because waiting made her notice too much. She noticed the empty place beside the third pillar where Captain Valor usually rested his palm before entering the restoration wing. She noticed that the handrail there was smoother than the others, worn by generations of attendants and by him most of all, because he never crossed the threshold quickly when someone frightened was on the other side. She noticed that the western doors did not feel closed like ordinary doors. They felt as if everyone aboard had placed one hand upon them and was holding them shut gently until the person within remembered which side was home. Her grandmother sat beside her with a thread spool in her lap, though she had not woven for nearly an hour. The spool was old, made from dark bone wood taken from one of the first inner groves planted after the vessel crossed the silent band. Its thread was not cloth thread, not truly, but a resonance filament used for small repairs in household memory screens, cradle lamps, and the little listening shells children used during early navigation lessons. Grandmother Sin kept turning it with her thumb. Each turn made the filament catch the hall light in a faint spiral, then vanish again as if deciding not to call attention to itself. "Will he know us?" Myra asked. Sin did not answer quickly. This was one of the customs of the restoration hall, though no attendant had ever written it into protocol. Questions asked outside the western doors were allowed to breathe before anyone replied, because some questions belonged partly to the one returning and partly to those who waited. Sin looked toward the sealed chamber, then toward the small table where the captain's cup had been placed with its cracked rim turned inward. "He may know us first as a feeling," she said. "Sometimes that is kinder than a name." Across the hall, Tareth of Navigation was speaking with one of the restoration attendants in a voice low enough that only those nearby could hear the shape of it. He had changed from his observation robes into plain gray cloth, as many had done, because the captain disliked being received by rank after a dense incarnation. The attendant's hands rested inside her sleeves, and the left sleeve bore the pale spiral marking of those trained to guide divided consciousness through return. She did not look worried. That steadiness troubled Tareth more than worry would have, because restoration attendants were trained to leave no unnecessary emotion in the air. He still turns toward the southern field, Tereth said. The attendant nodded. Earth orientation remained strong. His name there, not fully released. Tereth closed his eyes for a moment. Not in pain exactly, but in respect. Around them, no one pretended not to hear. Dense worlds were not dreams, and no one aboard the vessel spoke of them as lesser lives simply because they were temporary from the wider view. The mandate had forbidden that language long before Myra was born, long before Sin was born, long before even the captain's first command. A life entered in forgetting was still a whole life while it was being lived. To call it illusion was considered a failure of tenderness. Near the inner wall, two kitchen workers arrived carrying a covered tray they did not know where to put. They had brought evening broth, although restoration returns rarely took food immediately. The older of the two, Lynn, kept glancing toward the captain's cup and then away again, as if embarrassed by how much the sight of it affected her. She had prepared the bitter root blend he favored after long council sessions, the one everyone else said tasted like rainwater stored in old stone. He had always claimed it cleared the thread noise from his mind. Once, during a difficult crossing, he had come to the kitchens before first light and helped grind roots in silence because Lynn's apprentice had fallen ill and the morning ration would have been late. Put it there, Sin said, nodding toward the side table. He may not drink it, Lynn replied. Then it will know it was offered. That settled the matter. The tray was placed beside the salt fruit and the cracked cup, and the scent of bitter root slowly entered the hall. Several people smiled without quite meaning to. The smell did what announcements could not have done. It brought him nearer. Myra had seen the captain only in ordinary ways. She had seen him kneeling in the eastern garden to listen to a child explain why the irrigation pool sounded different after dream practice. She had seen him standing barefoot on the lower deck during pressure recalibration, one hand against the wall, laughing softly when the floor tremor made the youngest apprentices stumble into one another. She had seen him carry broken navigation towels to the repair alcove himself, because he said objects remembered how they were handled. None of these memories seemed important enough to explain why the hall felt hollow without him. Yet each one had remained aboard during his absence, tucked into corners, routines, and the small pauses people made where his voice would once have entered. A pressure change moved through the vessel. It was subtle, little more than a deepening beneath the floor and a warm pull at the ears, but everyone in the restoration hall felt it. The children looked to the adults, and the adults looked to the western doors. Above the archway, 3 thin rings of amber light narrowed into one. Somewhere behind the doors, the restoration field had shifted from gathering to listening. No one moved. Myra's grandmother placed a thread spool in her palm. Hold it gently, she said. Why? Because your hands are too busy looking for something to do. Myra almost smiled, but the western doors gave a low sound then, not opening, not unlocking, only answering some pressure from within. The sound traveled through the stone beneath them and into the benches, into knees and ribs and folded hands. Tereth stood. So did Lynn. Around the hall, people rose in uneven waves, not because rank required it, but because bodies sometimes understood reverence before thought gave permission. The attendant at the door lifted one hand. Not yet, she said. The words were soft, and no one resented them. Everyone aboard knew stories of returns that had been hurried by love. A mother who had called too soon and pulled her son back through 2 names at once. A navigator who had recognized his vessel before releasing the grief of his last child in a waterworld incarnation. A young observer who had woken laughing, then wept for 7 days because her hands no longer matched the hands she had used to bury her brother. Restoration was not the repair of a machine. It was the honoring of continuities that had overlapped without asking permission from the heart. Sin leaned close to Myra. When he comes through, do not ask him anything. I know. Do not say his title. I know. And if he does not look at you, Myra swallowed. Then he is still returning. Sin nodded. That is all. The vessel settled again into its long hum. Far above, beyond the restoration decks, the gardens would be dimming into blue. The night cooks would be opening the lower ovens. The navigation learners would be pretending to study while listening for any change in the western conduit. In the residential corridors, door curtains had likely been tied back, though no one would admit doing it, and the old floor lamps along the captain's route would have been cleaned without instruction. Ordinary life had not stopped, but it had bent around the restoration chamber, as water bent around a stone without losing the river. Tereth crossed to the third pillar and placed his hand over the worn place where the captain's hand usually rested. He did it only briefly, and with the mild embarrassment of a man caught speaking to an empty room. The restoration attendant saw and said nothing. Tereth had served beside Valor for 9 long crossings and 3 incarnate missions, though never into a field as dense as Earth's. He had been the one to argue against the captain's descent, not because the mission lacked necessity, but because he knew Valor's gift for attachment. Some commanders could observe a world and return with clean hands. Valor always came back carrying someone's sorrow as if it had been entrusted to him personally. From within the chamber came a voice. It was not loud. It did not form a word anyone in the hall could understand. Still, every face turned toward the doors with such sudden tenderness that Myra felt her own eyes sting before she knew why. The voice came again, lower this time, wrapped in the thick confusion of a language learned under gravity and grief. The attendant closed her eyes and listened past the sound, listening for the thread beneath it. He is asking for someone, she said. No one asked who. That, too, was patience. Lynn pressed both hands to her mouth. Tereth looked down. Sin's fingers tightened once around Myra's shoulder, then loosened. The hall held itself still while the life just lived moved invisibly among them. Somewhere in that chamber, the captain they knew was not yet only the captain they knew. He was also a man whose morning light had fallen through a different window, whose body had aged in another atmosphere, whose affections had braided themselves around names the vessel had never spoken. To welcome him home meant allowing those names to stand in the room first. The attendant turned toward the sealed doors and spoke in the old restoration cadence. Not loudly, not ceremonially. Her voice carried the simple firmness of someone calling across a familiar garden. You are aboard the vessel. Your breath is safe. No one will take the life from you. Let it rest where it belongs. For a while, nothing changed. Then the western doors began to open. They parted slowly, not with the clean obedience of lesser doors, but with the weighted care of stone and resonance releasing an agreement. Amber light widened across the floor. Warm air came with it, touched by restoration oils, salt, skin, and the faint metallic scent of a consciousness recently unbound from dense blood. The first attendants emerged on either side, their eyes lowered, their hands empty. Between them walked a man in a plain recovery robe, one hand hovering near the wall as if he had not yet decided whether the world could be trusted to remain steady. He was smaller than Myra expected. Not in body exactly, but in arrival. There was no force around him, no radiance, no command pressing the hall into awe. His hair was damp at the temples. His face looked tired in a way that made him seem less ancient rather than more. He paused at the threshold and looked over the hall without recognition settling fully anywhere. When his gaze passed over the salt fruit, it stopped. No one spoke. The captain looked at the bowl, then at the cup with the cracked rim, then at the covered broth. Something moved through his expression, fragile and almost painful. His hand lowered to the third pillar. His palm found the worn place without searching. Tereth bowed his head. Lynn began to cry, but quietly enough that the sound did not disturb the room. The captain drew one breath, then another. His eyes moved to Sin, lingered without certainty, then to Myra, then to the thread spool in her hands. For a moment, Myra thought he would pass over her as a stranger. Instead, his brow softened with the faintest trace of remembered amusement. Your hands, he said, voice rough from 2 worlds, are too busy looking for something to do. Myra forgot every instruction except the one that mattered and did not run to him. Sin made a sound that was almost laughter and almost grief. The hall exhaled, not all at once, but person by person. as if each had been carrying a small vessel of water and had finally found a place to set it down. The captain remained at the threshold, still not entirely returned, still carrying weather from a world most of them would never know. No one tried to hurry him across. No one called him by title. No one asked him what he had seen, what he had learned, or whether the mission had fulfilled the mandate. He looked back once into the restoration chamber. The attendant beside him waited. Whatever he saw there was not visible to the hall, but his face changed as one life made room for another without being erased. At last he turned toward the people who had kept his cup, his fruit, his root, his handprint on the pillar, and the silence in which a soul could return without being claimed too soon. Then Captain Valor stepped into the hall, and the ancient vessel received the sound of his footsteps again. The sound of his footsteps changed the hall before anyone moved toward him. It was not the old rhythm yet, not the easy measure by which apprentices had once known he was coming before he turned the corridor, but it carried enough of him that several faces altered in the same breath. His right foot still settled slightly before the left, a habit from an injury received long before Myra's grandmother had entered navigation, though the body restored at the threshold bore no wound from it. The vessel remembered such things in the living more faithfully than records did. Those who had waited heard the familiar pattern returning through uncertainty, and for a moment the whole lower hall seemed to listen with them. Captain Valor did not cross far. He came only 3 steps beyond the western doors and stopped where the amber field thinned into the ordinary light of the hall. One attendant remained near his left shoulder, close enough to steady him without touching him, while the other turned back to the chamber and adjusted the resonance veil with 2 fingers. The veil settled behind them with a quiet shimmer, closing not like a barrier, but like water restoring its surface after a hand had passed through. Valor looked toward it once, then away. His eyes were open, but they did not yet belong entirely to the place that held him. No one spoke his title. This restraint had been taught to children before they were old enough to understand why, and Myra now understood more of it than she had that morning. A title could pull too sharply on the vessel side thread. A name could do the same if offered before the returning soul had found its own center. Even love could become a summons if it reached too quickly. So the hall gave him the oldest kindness known to restoration. It allowed him to arrive without being required to answer. The attendant beside him lowered her hand toward the floor, palm open. The spiral set into the stone answered with a faint warmth that spread outward in a small ring around his feet. It was not a binding. Myra knew that because she had seen the same ring used for children after deep dream practice, when they woke, still carrying the color of places their bodies had never visited. The ring told the floor to soften its pressure and the air to slow its changes. It gave a returning mind fewer differences to measure at once. Valor looked down at the ring as if it were rain gathering around his boots. Then he lifted one bare foot slightly and placed it back with care. His recovery robe brushed the stone, plain gray, tied poorly at the waist because he had tied it himself and one side hung lower than the other. Lynn made a small movement, almost reaching to fix it. Tereth saw and shook his head once. The untidy knot remained, and somehow its wrongness made him more present than any ceremony would have done. Sin rose from the bench, but she did not approach. Her knees had troubled her for many cycles, and Valor had teased her about refusing new joint harmonics until she admitted that she liked knowing when the weather changed in the vessel's garden decks. She stood now with one hand on the bench rail and one hand resting lightly on Myra's shoulder. The thread spool lay in Myra's palm, gathering warmth from her skin. Its filament glimmered once, not from command, but from the natural answering of resonance to attention. Valor's gaze moved slowly along the hall. He saw the navigators, the kitchen workers, the record keepers, the children, the attendants, the old marks in the pillars, the bowl of salt fruit, the cup, the covered broth. Each thing seemed to reach him from a different distance. Some came close. Some remained far away, as if still seen through the thick glass of another life. When his eyes found the cup again, his face tightened with recognition so ordinary and so private that many looked down to spare him the burden of being watched. Lynn took one step forward and stopped. The movement made the scent of bitter root rise from the covered tray. Valor inhaled, his shoulders lowered, barely, but everyone near enough saw it. He looked at Lynn then, and for the first time recognition gathered around a person rather than an object. It did not settle fully. It trembled there, trying to remember which life had earned the familiarity. "You made it too strong," he said. Lynn covered her mouth again. Only after a moment did she answer. "You always say that after asking for it stronger." Valor considered this as though it were a piece of navigation data arriving from a distant field. Then a faint, worn amusement crossed his face. Not laughter, not relief. Something smaller and more precious because it had survived the crossing. The hall did not react loudly, but a softness moved through those gathered, and Myra understood that memories sometimes return not as a door opening, but as one cup being placed back on the right shelf. The restoration attendant inclined her head toward the side benches. "Would you sit?" Valor glanced behind him again. "Not there," she said gently. "Here, if you can." He looked at the nearest bench. The old navigator seated there rose without instruction, leaving the center place empty, though it had not been reserved. Valor moved toward it with the care of someone walking after long illness, not because the body lacked strength, but because the mind had not yet agreed to the body's certainty. His hand brushed the third pillar as he passed. The contact was brief, but the worn stone received him, and his fingers curled against it as if some part of him had found an old path in darkness. When he sat, the hall sat with him, not all at once. The oldest remained standing until the attendants lowered their eyes. The children waited for the adults. The kitchen workers arranged themselves near the tray because having something to tend made the waiting bearable. Tereth stayed by the pillar. He had not yet greeted him. Myra thought this strange until she saw his face and understood that some people wait longer when they have missed someone more. A young record keeper named Leora knelt near the wall with a slate across her knees. She had been assigned to witness the return, but her stylist had not moved since the doors opened. The record would later say the captain emerged in stable form, Earth orientation retained, name continuity partial, sensory anchors effective, recognition gradual. It would not say that Lynn's hand shook when she uncovered the broth. It would not say that Sin had stopped breathing when Valor spoke to Myra. It would not say that Tereth looked like a man standing before a verdict no one had delivered. The spiral archives held many kinds of truth, but the living always carried the ones too delicate for inscription. The attendant accepted the cup from Lynn and placed it in Valor's hands. He held it carefully, thumb finding the crack along the rim without needing to look. His eyes closed. The hall watched the gesture with the reverence usually given to greater things. Though aboard the vessel, greater things had often hidden inside gestures small enough to miss. The crack had come from a morning when a child in the learning hall had dropped the cup after trying to curry too many dishes at once. Valor had refused every offer to mend it because the child had cried less when he said the cup had gained a memory. He did not drink. He held the cup near his chest and listened to something no one else could hear. The amber ring beneath his feet dimmed, then returned. The restoration attendant watched his breathing. Across the hall, one of the younger children leaned against his mother's side and whispered whether the captain was sad. His mother touched 2 fingers to the child's wrists, the quiet sign for later. The question remained between them, unanswered but not dismissed. At length, Valor opened his eyes. There was grief in them, but it was not theatrical, not the kind that asked others to gather around it. It was the grief of someone who had awakened with both hands still shaped around a life that was no longer there to hold. He looked at the cup and at the floor. "I had a daughter," he said. No one answered too quickly. The attendant beside him lowered herself to sit on the stone, bringing her face below his rather than above it. In restoration, those guiding return rarely stood over the newly awakened once memory began speaking. "It is not necessary to release her here," she said. Valor's fingers tightened on the cup. "She was old when I left." "I know." She did not believe in any of this. "That is allowed." The answer passed through the hall with quiet force. Myra saw several adults close their eyes, and she wondered how many had returned from worlds where the spiral was not known, where oversouls were guessed at through grief or denied because the air itself was too dense to remember. In the learning halls, children were taught that forgetting was not failure. Here, in the restoration hall, Myra saw the cost of that teaching. A life could be real enough to love what it could not remember, and then the one who returned had to carry both the love and the forgetting without correcting the dead. Baylor bowed his head. The attendant did not touch him. No one did. The vessel's hum seemed lower now, though Myra knew the conduits had not changed. Perhaps the hall had simply become more aware of the sound beneath all other sounds. Beneath the bench, the stone was warm through her soles. She pressed her toes against it and imagined roots, though she knew they were not roots, only old resonance lines running through floors laid before most of the present crew's family names had taken shape. Tereth finally moved. He crossed the space between pillar and bench, each step measured, and stopped an arm's length away. Baylor did not look up at first. Tereth waited as patiently as the rest, but his patience had edges. He had argued against the descent, had remained aboard during the long earth measure, had watched the captain's vessel-side body breathe in the chamber while reports from the incarnate thread arrived only as fragments through the oversoul lattice. Now the man he had tried to protect sat before him grieving a daughter Tereth had never known, and there was no victory in having feared correctly. Baylor lifted his eyes. Tereth's face changed. The formal greeting he had prepared disappeared before it reached his mouth. "You still tie recovery robes like a child," he said. For a moment, the hall did not know whether this had been wise. Then Baylor looked down at the uneven knot. His expression shifted, slowly, as if humor were returning through a narrow passage. "You still begin tenderness as insult." Tereth exhaled. That was enough. He bowed, but not deeply, and sat beside him without asking permission. Their shoulders did not touch. The space between them held 9 crossings, old arguments, shared command, silence, resentment, loyalty, and the immense mercy of not speaking about any of it too soon. Myra watched them from beside Sin. She had heard stories of captains receiving honors after return, of councils gathering, of resonance choirs singing a vessel's gratitude through the central decks. None of that happened here. The lower hall remained full of ordinary discomfort. Someone shifted on a bench that had grown hard. A child's stomach made a faint sound. The covered broth cooled. An attendant adjusted a floor ring with the edge of her sleeve. An old navigator coughed and looked ashamed of the noise. These small interruptions did not weaken the moment. They kept it human enough for him to stay. The western doors remained partly open behind him. Through them, Myra could see only a narrow portion of the restoration chamber. Pale stone, hanging veils, the dark curve of the return basin, and the faint spiral lines that rose and vanished in the air where attendants had been working since before dawn. Beyond that lay the deeper chamber where the captain's vessel body had rested through the Earth incarnation, tended by those who kept breath, pulse, and thread alignment from drifting apart. Children were rarely allowed to see inside. Today, the open doors revealed just enough to make the hidden work feel near without making it spectacle. A messenger from the navigation decks arrived at the far entrance and stopped before stopping fully into the hall. She was young, still wearing the blue shoulder cord of a cartographer in apprenticeship, and her cheeks were flushed from taking the lower spiral ramp too quickly. When she saw Baylor seated among the others, she froze. The data shell in her hands gave a quiet pulse. Tereth looked toward her with warning in his eyes. Not anger, only the reminder that no vessel matter outweighed a soul's return unless the hall itself had opened to void. The messenger bowed her head and remained by the entrance. Baylor saw the movement. His attention sharpened for the first time, not fully into command, but toward the old habit of noticing what others hoped he would not notice. "What is unsettled?" he asked. Tereth answered before the messenger could speak. "Nothing that cannot wait." Baylor looked at him. Tereth held the gaze. "Let it wait." The captain's eyes moved to the messenger, then to the shell, then to the floor. The old rhythm of responsibility reached for him. Everyone felt it. It would have been easy for the hall to welcome that return because command was familiar, cleaner than grief, easier to honor than confusion. But the attendant beside him raised 2 fingers, not toward him, toward Tereth. The signal was small. Tereth saw it and understood that even the mandate must not be used to pull a returning consciousness away from the life still releasing its hold. Baylor's hand tightened once around the cup and then loosened. He nodded, though the motion cost him. The messenger stepped backward into the corridor and waited out of sight. No one praised the captain for restraint. No one praised Tereth for guarding it. Mature civilizations did not make performance out of necessary tenderness. Lynn brought the broth at last. She knelt, set the bowl on a low stand, and unfolded the warming cloth. Steam rose, carrying root, mineral salt, garden onion, and the faint smoke of the lower ovens. Valor looked at it with suspicion so familiar that Lynn's tears returned as laughter this time. "You cannot accuse me yet," she said. "You have not tasted it." "I have known your broth across 3 bodies," he replied. "2, she said. He frowned lightly. "2 aboard," she said, "and 1 you complained through from the Hesh crossing because you said the memory field made everything taste like metal." Valor considered this. "Hesh," he murmured. The word altered the air around the older navigators. It belonged to a crossing before Myra's birth, before her mother's vow to the garden decks, before the repair of the eastern hall where old gold seams still ran beside newer black stone. Hesh had been a civilization that sang through pressure instead of voice, or so the children said when they turned lessons into rumor. Valor did not explain the memory. He only let the name pass through him and fade. The archives would later mark this as a widening of vessel-side continuity, but in the hall it looked like a tired man remembering the taste of bad broth. He lifted the spoon. His hand trembled once, then steadied. Lynn pretended not to see. Tereth pretended not to see Lynn pretending. Myra saw both and held the thread spool tighter, learning that adulthood aboard the vessel seemed to consist largely of noticing pain and deciding which portions of it should be left alone. Valor tasted the broth. The hall waited with unreasonable seriousness. "Too much smoke," he said. Lynn bowed her head. "Welcome home, then." This time the laughter moved farther. Though still softly, it reached the inner wall, the young record keepers, the children, the old navigators, even the attendant at the western doors. Valor did not laugh with them, but his mouth remembered the shape of it. The amber ring beneath his feet dimmed again and did not fully return. The air pressure shifted by the smallest measure, and the vessel's ordinary environment came nearer to him. Sin touched Myra's shoulder. "Now," she whispered. Myra looked up, startled. "Now what?" "The spool." Myra had forgotten it was in her hand. She looked at the bonewood, at the filament wound around it, at the small catching spirals of light beneath her fingers. This was not a ceremonial object, not important enough for a captain's return. It belonged in repair baskets and learning drawers, but Sin's expression left no room for argument. Myra stood. Crossing the hall felt longer than it was. Her bare feet found the worn places in the stone where others had stood before her. She passed the bowl of salt fruit and smelled its sharp sweetness beneath the bitter root and broth smoke. Valor looked toward her as she approached. An uncertainty returned to his face, not because he did not remember her at all, but because memory had not yet chosen where to place her. She stopped 3 steps away, as children were taught. "Grandmother said your listening shell flickers," Myra said. Sin closed her eyes behind her. Valor looked at the spool. "My listening shell?" "The one by the southern bench in the learning hall. The little one. You said not to replace it because it only flickers when someone is thinking too loudly near it." A few people smiled. Valor stared at the spool, then at Myra, and the present hall seemed to tilt around some small interior recognition. He held out one hand. Myra placed the spool in his palm. His fingers closed over it gently, and the filament answered him with a faint spiral of pale light, dimmer than it should have been, but alive. "You repaired it?" he asked. "Not yet." "Why not?" Myra glanced back at Sin, then chose honesty, because children in the learning halls were warned that false humility disturbed resonance more than pride did. "I was afraid I would ruin the old thread." Valor looked at her for a long moment. The hall held still around the exchange, understanding before Myra did that some part of him had been given a bridge. "Old thread is not ruined by careful hands," he said, "only by hurried ones." Sin bowed her head. Myra felt heat rise in her face, but she did not look away. The captain's hand remained open now, the spool resting against his palm. He seemed less distant while holding it, not fully returned, not free of the other life, not ready for titles or reports or the waiting shell of command, but nearer by the measure of one child, one broken listening shell. one unfinished repair deliberately left for him because someone had believed ordinary work might call him home more gently than honor. The restoration attendant watched the exchange and then looked toward the western doors. The second attendant nodded from the threshold. The listening phase had ended. The release phase would continue for days, perhaps longer, depending on how deeply Earth had braided itself into him. The hall seemed to understand without announcement that this was not the end of return, only the first evening of it. People began breathing differently, preparing not to depart, but to resume life around him slowly. The messenger remained in the corridor. The broth remained warm. The salt fruit waited. Somewhere above, the garden lamps had completed their blue dimming, and the residential corridors would now be filling with the low domestic sounds of bowls, sandals, door curtains, children being told to lower their voices and then forgetting. The vessel had not paused for the captain, yet nothing aboard had continued unchanged. That was how home received the returning, not by stopping its life, but by making room within its rhythms until the one who came back could hear where he belonged. Valor turned the spool once with his thumb. The filament caught the hall light and made a small spiral before vanishing. His eyes followed it, and for the first time since the doors opened, his gaze rose beyond the people immediately before him. It moved toward the western windows high above the corridor, where the old glass showed no stars from this angle, only the dark reflection of the restoration hall and the small lights gathered within it. In that reflection, the waiting faces looked like another constellation. He spoke quietly, perhaps to Tereth, perhaps to the attendant, perhaps to the life that had not yet finished leaving him. I thought the world I knew was all there was. No one corrected him. After a moment, Sin answered from the benches, her old voice steady in the softened hall. That is why we return slowly. Valor lowered his eyes to the spool again. The words seemed to reach him without demanding anything from him. Around him, the ancient vessel continued its patient hum, carrying gardens, kitchens, corridors, sleeping chambers, navigation decks, repair alcoves, learning halls, and the Western Restoration Chamber within one unbroken body of memory. The captain sat among his people with broth cooling beside him and another life still warm in his hands. And for that evening, no wider horizon was asked of him than this one. The hall did not empty after the first return. It loosened instead, as gatherings aboard the vessel often did when no one wished to be the first to admit that the central moment had passed. Some of the children were taken away by parents who promised they could ask questions in the morning if the questions remained, while others were allowed to sleep against folded cloaks on the side benches. The older navigators spoke in low tones near the third pillar, their hands occasionally touching the worn stone as they passed. The western doors stayed partly open, and the amber light within them made a quiet border between what had been restored and what was still finding its way back. Captain Valor remained seated with the broth beside him and the thread spool resting in his hand. He had eaten only 3 spoonfuls, enough for Lynn to stop worrying in the way kitchen workers stop worrying, which meant she still watched his face every time he swallowed. Tereth sat beside him with his elbows on his knees, looking not at the captain but at the floor rings slowly fading around his feet. The restoration attendant had withdrawn to the edge of hearing, close enough to return if his breath changed, distant enough that no one could mistake care for custody. Myra stayed beside Sin and tried to hold still, though the whole hall felt full of things she was not old enough to ask. From the corridor beyond the western wing came the ordinary sounds of the vessel's evening life. A cart with linen wheels passed over the old floor seams, carrying clean wraps toward the recovery rooms. Somewhere farther back, 2 apprentices argued in whispers about whether the lower ovens had burned the second salt bread again. The garden bell sounded once from the upper decks, its tone softened by the miles of stone, metal, rootwork, water channels, memory glass, and inhabited passageways between there and the restoration hall. Valor lifted his head at the sound. His face did not brighten, but it steadied, as if the bell had named something older than the life he had just left. Evening garden, he said. Tereth nodded. Blue phase. Valor closed his eyes. Are the night flowers still opening late? Later than they should, Lynn said before Tereth could answer. The western root beds have been stubborn since you left. Since I left, Valor repeated, and the words did not settle easily in him. No one corrected the measure. For those aboard, He had been in the chamber for one span of vessel time, sleeping and breathing under restoration care while his incarnate thread moved through decades of Earth. For him, the phrase had to cross a greater distance. Since you left could mean the day his body had been brought into the Western Chamber. It could mean the day a child on Earth had first looked at him and called him father. It could mean the morning he had grown old enough to understand that the sky above that world would never open into the halls he could not remember. The messenger returned once more to the corridor entrance, but this time she did not carry herself like a person arriving with urgency. She had wrapped the data shell in a plain cloth and held it against her chest. Tareth saw her and stood, crossing the hall before Valor could fully turn. Their voices remained low, but Myra caught the word driftway and then the word partial. The messenger's eyes flicked once toward the captain, then down to the floor. Tareth listened, asked one question, and sent her away with a gesture so small it looked almost like blessing. Valor watched him return. You are keeping the vessel from me. I am keeping you from the vessel, Tareth said. That is a dangerous habit. It has kept you alive more often than your own habits have. Valor accepted this with a tiredness that might once have become humor. The exchange had the shape of many older exchanges, worn smooth by repetition, but the spaces inside it had changed. Tareth sat again, not as close this time. He looked at the cup in Valor's hand and then at the robe knot still hanging unevenly. There are reports, he said. There are always reports. Tonight they can remain smaller than you are. Valor looked toward the corridor where the messenger had vanished. Smaller, he said. Tareth's face softened. You taught that to 3 generations of observers. I do not remember teaching it. You will. The answer was neither promise nor comfort. It was spoken as one speaks of water returning through a channel after blockage is cleared. Not certain in its timing, but trusted in its nature. Valor lowered his gaze to the thread spool, turning it slowly between his fingers. The filament brightened where it crossed his thumb. Myra felt a small pride rise in her and then tried to make it quiet, because pride could make the filament jump if it was watching too closely. The restoration attendant approached only when Valor's breathing changed. She lowered herself again to the stone, not beside him, not in front of him, but slightly away, leaving him room to refuse her presence without having to speak. Your oversoul is widening the vessel side thread, she said. Valor frowned faintly. It feels like losing edges. That is one way it is felt. I had edges there. Yes. He looked at her then, and the hall grew quiet around the exchange because the attendant had not softened the answer. She had not told him that the edges were false, or temporary, or merely dense world arrangement. She had given the life its dignity by allowing its boundaries to have mattered. Myra saw Sin watching with deep approval. There were forms of kindness that did not rescue a person from sorrow. They simply refused to make sorrow smaller than it was. Valor's hand moved unconsciously toward his left wrist, where no bracelet lay. His fingers closed around absence. The gesture passed quickly, but Lynn saw it and turned her face away. Tareth saw it and did not move. The attendant saw it and waited. After a moment, Valor looked down at his empty wrist as if surprised by the bare skin. My daughter made something for me, he said, before her hands began to shake. The attendant nodded. Do you want the memory held near or given distance? Near, he said too quickly, then closed his eyes. Near, but not open. The attendant lifted 2 fingers toward the western chamber, and one of the inner veils answered with a dim pulse. Nothing visible crossed the hall. There was only a faint change in the air, the scent of old rain and dry paper, and then Valor's shoulders eased by the smallest measure. No one asked what had been brought near. The people of the vessel had learned through many returns and many mistakes that not every memory needed witnesses simply because it had entered a public room. Sin whispered to Myra, remember this. Myra looked up. What part? All of it. That was an impossible instruction, but Myra understood its seriousness. She tried to remember the smell of broth, the cooling amber light, the way the thread spool glowed more strongly in Valor's hand than it ever had in hers, the messenger's restraint, the sadness around an invisible bracelet, the stone warmth under her feet, the fact that adults did not always know what to do with love except sit near it and keep quiet. In the learning halls, remembrance was often practiced with shells, tones, and pattern sequences, Here, it seemed less like holding information and more like allowing a moment to leave its shape inside her. The Western Restoration doors opened wider. Two attendants emerged carrying folded cloths, bowls, and the pale instruments of return that had already been cleaned of their brightness. Their faces were tired. One of them paused near the threshold to press her palm against the wall, not ceremonially, but as a worker steadying herself after long concentration. The other smiled at Lynn when she noticed the broth, and Lynn lifted the bowl slightly in answer. Aboard the vessel, even sacred labor eventually required food, warm cloth, and someone remembering who had not eaten since morning. Valor watched the attendants pass. How long was I difficult? One of them looked back. In which life? A soft sound passed through the hall, not quite laughter. Valor lowered his head, accepting the answer. On this side. The attendant considered. Less difficult than during the Hess crossing, more difficult than after the Orchard descent, exactly as difficult as we expected from Earth. Tereth made a quiet sound. That is a generous record. It is an accurate one, she replied. Valor's mouth moved again toward the shape of laughter, and this time a small breath accompanied it. The hall did not seize upon it. No one turned the breath into celebration. They allowed it to exist and pass. The restoration attendant near his feet watched the floor ring fade completely, then touched the stone once to release the softened pressure. The hall's ordinary gravity returned around him by degrees, and Valor shifted as his body registered the difference. For the first time since his emergence, he looked toward the entrance that led deeper into the vessel, not the western doors behind him, but the long passage ahead, where the lower hall bent toward the residential corridors, the kitchens, the learning decks, the old navigation stairs, and eventually the observation chambers facing the unslept dark. His gaze moved as if following routes his mind had not yet fully reclaimed. Myra knew those routes well enough to imagine them with him. The handrail patched in 3 metals after the 7th hall frost, the mural children had repainted badly and the elders had refused to correct, the narrow place where people carrying laundry baskets always had to turn sideways, the southern bench with the broken listening shell waiting. Can you walk? Tereth asked. Valor looked at him. I came through the doors. That was 3 steps and stubbornness. I remember you being less old. I remember you being less dead. The words landed sharply, then softened when Tereth looked away. No one laughed. Valor studied his friend's profile. Something in him seemed to understand a portion of the waiting he had not witnessed. He set the cup down carefully. Crack turned inward as always. Then he held the thread spool out toward Myra. She stepped forward to take it, but he did not release it at once. Repair the shell, he said. Myra nodded. Not tomorrow because I said it. When your hands are ready. I will know? No, he said. You will listen. He let the spool go. The filament dimmed in her palm, and she felt the weight of unfinished work become less like fear and more like invitation. Sin's hand came to her shoulder again. Across the hall, Leora finally moved her stylus over the slate, writing something that would become too formal later and yet had begun in this quiet exchange. The archives would preserve the return of the captain. Myra suspected the vessel would preserve the rest. Valor stood with help only from the bench. The attendant rose when he did, but did not touch him. Tereth stood beside him, one hand close without offering itself. For a moment, Valor remained still, adjusting to height, air, light, the absence of an old earth body, the presence of a restored one, the strange mercy and cruelty of strength returning before grief had finished speaking. His robe loosened at the waist. Lynn stepped forward at last and fixed the knot with brisk, tearful irritation. You would shame the Western Hall, she said. I thought you were forbidden to command me tonight. I am not commanding, I am preserving basic dignity. Valor looked down at the corrected knot. Then he looked at her hands, red from kitchen heat, steady now that they had work to do. Thank you, Lynn. She bowed her head once, unable to answer. The words were simple, but they changed her face as dimply as any honor might have. She took the empty bowl and cup, though he had not finished either, because she knew he would not want them fussed over in public. Before leaving, she placed one salt fruit in his hand. He looked at it, then at her. She pointed toward him with the authority of all kitchens across all ages and all vessels. Eat that before the corridor. He obeyed. The act settled something in the room more than the standing had. Captain Valor, who had crossed a dense world and returned through the western chamber with another life still warm in his consciousness, stood barefoot in an unevenly tied robe eating salt fruit because a kitchen worker had told him to. The children who remained awake watched with solemn attention. The old navigators looked relieved in a way they might have denied. The vessel's hum continued beneath them, unchanged and yet newly audible, as if ordinary life had quietly reclaimed the right to surround him. They began walking, not toward the navigation decks, not toward council, not toward the observation chamber, but toward the southern learning hall. Tereth did not ask why. Sin and Myra followed at a distance, as did Leora, though she pretended to be gathering witness notes rather than accompanying them. A few others came as far as the corridor entrance and then stopped, understanding that every return narrowed after the public threshold. The western hall remained lit behind them, attendants moving quietly within it, restoring order without erasing evidence that something sacred and difficult had happened there. The corridor beyond the restoration wing was warm from the evening pipes. Its walls bore repairs from centuries that did not match one another. Pale stone beside dark steamwork, copper spirals beside older bone inlay, newer resonance glass fitted into frames carved by hands whose family lines had long since merged into other names. Valor's hand brushed the rail as he walked. Sometimes his fingers paused where texture changed. Sometimes he looked at a side passage as though expecting a different turn, perhaps from Earth, perhaps from some older vessel memory not yet properly placed. At the first bend, two children from the residential deck stood in their night wraps, caught where they had clearly been told not to come. Their mother hurried behind them, embarrassed and breathless. Valor stopped. The children stared at him with the terrible seriousness of the very young. One held a small paper spiral folded from lesson scraps. The other had nothing to offer and seemed distressed by this until Valor crouched slowly, bringing himself closer to their height. "You are supposed to be asleep," he said. "So are you," the child with the paper spiral replied. Tereth turned his face toward the wall. Valor accepted the paper spiral with both hands. The fold was uneven, and one edge had been torn and repaired with a smear of kitchen paste. He studied it with more attention than he had given the messenger's data shell. Then he tucked it carefully inside the loose fold of his robe. The child without a gift looked at the floor. So Valor held out the salt fruit seed he had kept in his palm. "Plant this badly," he said. "They grow better when children do not overthink them." The mother whispered an apology, but Valor shook his head. No apology belonged there. The children were gathered up and led away, one glancing back with triumph, the other holding the seed as if entrusted with a navigation key. Myra watched them disappear and wondered how many small objects aboard the vessel had entered history by being mishandled kindly. Perhaps that was why the place felt so old without feeling distant. It had kept too many ordinary offerings to become merely grand. The southern learning hall was dim when they reached it. Its floor lamps had been lowered for night, leaving the tables in pools of amber and blue. Shells, slates, thread frames, resonance bowls, and unfinished lesson spirals lay where apprentices had left them under the assumption that morning would return everything to order. Along the far bench sat the listening shell Myra had mentioned, small enough to fit in two hands, its surface dull except for a faint, intermittent flicker along one side. Valor stopped at the threshold, and this time no one hurried him. The room smelled of waxed stone, child-warmed cushions, dried leaf ink, and the faint mineral tang of teaching shells left open too long. Valor drew the air in slowly. His eyes moved over the benches, the low shelves, the uneven mural of the first spiral crossing, the corner where children hid when they wanted to hear advanced navigation lessons. He touched the doorframe. This room had known him not as captain first, but as someone who sat on floors when a child could not understand why observation changed what was observed. He had kept his absence in unfinished questions. Myra went to the southern bench and placed the thread spool beside the listening shell. The shell flickered at once, though no one touched it. Valor watched from the doorway. Sin stayed behind him, allowing the child to enter first because the repair belonged to her now. Tereth leaned against the wall with his arms folded, but his face had lost some of its guardedness. The restoration attendant remained in the corridor, visible only by the pale edge of her sleeve. Valor crossed the room and sat on the floor before the bench. The motion was slow, awkward, and entirely familiar to those who had known him before the descent. Myra sat opposite him. For a while, neither touched the shell. The flicker came and went, catching along the damaged side like a thought refusing to become sound. It listened while you were gone, Myra said. To whom? Everyone. Badly. That is still listening. She smiled despite herself. Then her face grew serious again. Did Earth listen badly? Valor looked at the shell for a long time. The question was too large for a child and exactly the kind children asked because no one had yet taught them which doors adults were afraid to open. Tareth shifted, but did not interrupt. Sin remained still. The vessel hummed beyond the walls, carrying the corridor sounds, the restoration hall, the kitchens, the gardens, the messenger waiting with the wrapped data shell, and all the lives that would resume around this answer whether it came or not. At last, Valor said, Earth listened as if it were alone. Myra considered this. That seemed sadder than saying it did not listen at all. She touched the thread spool, but did not unwind it. The shell flickered once. Valor's eyes remained on it, though Myra sensed he was also seeing skies, streets, rooms, hands, faces, perhaps a daughter who had not believed in any of this and had still been loved by one who did. The learning hall held the answer without asking him to make it complete. Then we should listen better for it, Myra said. Valor looked at her. She wondered if she had spoken wrongly, too simply, or too much like a child repeating mandate lessons without understanding what they cost. But Valor's expression did not close. It opened with pain, and beneath the pain was recognition, not of her alone, but of the civilization that had raised a child to answer a world's loneliness with listening rather than conquest. He bowed his head once, not as captain to student, but as one witness to another. Yes, he said, we should. The shell's damaged side brightened, not fully, not repaired, not ready, but bright enough that Myra saw the old spiral pattern beneath the dullness and understood where the first thread would need to enter. Valor did not reach to guide her hands. Tareth did not speak of the waiting reports. Sin did not turn the moment into instruction. The final blue of evening deepened through the high glass, and somewhere far beyond the vessel's walls, stars moved in fields no one aboard believed they had finished understanding. Later, the archives would preserve the return as a matter of continuity, Earth orientation, vessel recognition, and the captain's first stable statement regarding the dense world. They will record that he resumed partial presence in the Southern Learning Hall before answering any summons from navigation. They will record that the mandate's next inquiry widened after his return, though not that night. They would not fully record the salt fruit seed, the crooked robe knot, the child's torn paper spiral, the broth judged too smoky, or the way a damaged listening shell brightened when Earth was named lonely. But those who lived aboard remembered. They remembered because the vessel gave them places to put such things. Worn rails, old benches, repaired cups, dim halls, bowls beside pillars, unfinished work left for careful hands. They remembered that Captain Valor did not return all at once, and that no one worthy of loving him had required him to. They remembered that a life could be left behind without being made smaller, and that home was not the place that erased other worlds, but the place patient enough to receive what those worlds had made of you. And in the Southern Learning Hall, before reports, before councils, before the next widening of the mandate, a child and the returned captain sat together beside a damaged shell and listened for the larger universe inside the silence.
If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Vaharat library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.